I'm not going to talk for a huge amount of time on this, but I thought I've been kind of rehearsing in writing recently in a couple of different things in different places. Some metaphors for generative AI in the university and the education sector. Um, Partly because I think I come from a kind of humanities background where everything gets wrangled into and understood through kind of metaphors and things of this sort. But I think in reflection on this, I've been thinking about what the best metaphors or analogies are to help us thinking about generative AI in the higher education classroom and in our university context. So as in the title or the brief blurb for this talk, I talked about the idea of it being a slightly uncanny guest at our table. And I've written about this in a couple of places. But this idea of generative AI being like a guest that's sort of appeared within, at our dining table or in our kind of our home, our place of business, whatever. But it's slightly uncanny is a derivation and slight retooling of a metaphor from the German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche. So he used the idea of the uncanny guest to represent nihilism at the end of the 19th century. So he wrote in The Will to Power, nihilism stands at the door. Whence comes this uncanniest of all guests? So he's writing at the end of the 19th century, talking about nihilism, talking about the idea that our fundamental beliefs in religious truths, for example, or an absolute of human nature might not be true. And when people start to realize that what we're taking as absolute truth might not be, everything's up for grabs. It's chaos. And so there's a kind of guest whose presence has consequences that haven't yet been felt. So when Nietzsche talks about the uncanny guest, he means someone's come in, but we haven't really worked out that their presence is about to throw everything into turmoil. So then, of course, Nietzsche predicts that during the 20th century, the collapse in universal values will lead to a massive clash of ideological systems and chaos. And he dies in 1900, so he doesn't get to see how right he is about that. He spent 10 years in a mental institution after dying of syphilis, which he contracted from a prostitute. So that's a typical philosopher's death in that way. But his predictions from the late 1880s about what the 20th century would be like turned out to be eerily true. There were big clashes of people with ideas about how things ought to be, and a redrawing of ideological perspectives and huge, big, different views of how things ought to be, and a lack of absolute shared values. So, in his sense, the guest was uncanny for him, and that the nihilism of the uncanny guest questioned what we already believe to be true, questioned our norms of understanding in some senses. So I thought this might be an interesting metaphor to steal and retool for two reasons, really. One, I think if we think about AI, it's a kind of person or system or process or idea that's in our world, but is not of it. It's not of the university system. In some senses it is, because it was made by university academics and things of this sort, but it's kind of different to the rest of we know what university staff are like in a variety of ways. We know what scholarship and academics in this world is. But there seems to be something present in it now that's slightly different. And the word uncanny, of course, has an interesting overlap with another use for it in AI. So one thing you've noticed with AI drawing is how weird it is. And there's a phrase that's used in people talking about graphic design and representation of humans, which some of you will be familiar with, called the uncanny valley. People are familiar with this term. And it's the idea that as something becomes more lifelike, it becomes more relatable to us as humans until it gets just a bit too lifelike, but still not human. And then it just makes us feel really uncomfortable. The example of these people often use is things like dolls and things. So if I get, I'm brought with me today, I often bring with me a pencil and some blue tack and a bit of paper, and I draw a face on it and make it into sticky. And he becomes our friend during the session, and we attribute personality to him quite happily. But if I kind of make it kind of more human and put clothes on him and things, it gets to a point of similarity to humans where it stops being kind of cute or interesting and starts to feel a little bit uncomfortable. Think of not only dolls, which very much can do that kind of. But also, if you think of fake humans, mannequins, and things. So mannequins are used a lot in horror films because they're creepy. They are. That is when the representation has gone from being more relatable, to being not quite almost mistake it for a human, but something's off. And the something is offness gives us a bit of a shiver. So this is often known in I'm sure in areas where they talk about graphic representation and human relationships to models and things, is the uncanny valley. Robots have had, human simulation devices of various sorts have had problems with this, and they all became too odd. And many of the more realistic human representations from AI seem to qualify for this. I saw one the other day from I think it's an Instagram or Twitter account that I look at, which is about the fact that Facebook is now largely dominated by older people posting things that are AI thinking they're real. And saying, why doesn't this get more retweets? And why do we never see pictures like this? And they all often support our military or support certain religions. But the more you look at them, they often have three fingers. And, or whatever, they're just kind of, when you zoom in, they're kind of not right in a whole variety of ways. So there's an uncanniness value. So I thought the uncanny guest, Nietzsche's idea of nihilism, say in the 1880s, and he was writing about it, was quite appropriate as a metaphor for generative AI as an uncanny guest. The other bit, of course, is his prediction that although the slow collapse of values in the late 19th century didn't seem that big a deal, it was just kind of intellectual curiosity and the collapse that everyone believes in one God or everyone believes in certain things. He predicted this was going to lead to competing ideologies emerging and this massive clash of values and tumults of war and things. So far, although we have seen generative AI in the last 2 or 3 years, particularly as something which we can't move for conversation about in higher education, if you go and walk around a university campus in 3 weeks' time when the students are here, it will largely look the same. There'll be people in rooms saying stuff and people writing it down, and people then going to exams. So the university, on one hand, is full of there's a prediction that everything must change, nothing's going to be the same, and yet everything's the same. So in a way, we might be in that kind of interregnum period, like the 1890s were for Nietzsche, when this prediction is kind of clear that this can't hold. This kind of, and the university model is in real potential crisis, but it hasn't happened yet. So we're starting to see little kind of hints that AI is starting to affect things. So some areas suddenly have a massive rise in pieces of work that they're really not comfortable marking because they look like they're all generated by AI. If people are familiar with UCAS, the university's fantastic central university application service based in the leafy town of Cheltenham, next to Cheltenham Racecourse, UCAS have just announced recently they are getting rid of the personal statement. Some of us had to go and do talks at schools about how to write your personal statement. I mean, in a way, I don't mourn the loss of the personal statement because it was just a means for children to demonstrate how middle class they were by saying they've been captain of the debating club or played in cricket or whatever. So, but UCAS has said they're going to split it into a series of questions now that you answer, like a job thing where you have to set questions rather than just tell us everything. And UCAS said that they are mainly doing this because it will better serve universities in making decisions. The real reason for anyone who's talked to anyone who works at UCAS or has been involved with our missions at universities is that this year particularly, although they suspected it the previous year, they got personal statements that were almost all the same. They were just written by ChatGPT. Whether the kid was from Darlington doing physics or from Sussex doing philosophy, the personal statement had almost the same tone. It just killed the personal statement off. So there are little signs in the university sector that there is going to be some massive change. But actually, there are so many existing norms in universities. Universities seem like places, the wider perception of universities is that they're hugely radical places, the kind of stalwarts of the woke, ruining our conventional society and full of radicals changing everything. Anyone who's worked in a university for more than 10 minutes knows they are extremely conservative places in many ways. Everyone does things the way they've always been done. and they're really traditional in all sorts, their own traditions, peculiar traditions to outsiders. But universities have got all sorts of norms and practices. And so, in a sense, this metaphor of Nietzsche's uncanny guest of nihilism to GAI as an uncanny guest university is a saying that there is the potential for us to have to change how we do everything. Now, people in universities are reluctant to change much at all quite often. I mean, trying to get people to change the wording of their assignment title. And say, could that clause not come out? Certainly not. I've always done it this way, and I've always got appallingly bad work, but that's the way I like it. Well, whatever, people won't change. So the idea that there was massive, massive change on the horizon is threatening. And I mean, many of us might welcome the fact that something's going to upend much of university practice. Universities have often replicated social privilege for generations. All our prime ministers going from largely the same universities forever. All sorts of ways in universities have practiced exclusion, exclusion of women from certain disciplines, exclusion of ethnic minorities, reinscribing of all sorts of class things. Universities have, amongst, as well as being forces for good in many ways, have also been conservative forces in terms of sort of social progress. So there is clearly much wrong in the way universities create knowledge, serve communities, reproduce social practice. But at the same time, there's a real concern that what this guest is, who is going to be upturning everything, whose presence is going to mean that we have to do everything differently, might lead to. Firstly, it's worth thinking about what the behaviour our guest, this uncanny guest, is going to do. Firstly, we might think, well, this is fantastic because it's about new ways of doing things, fantastically new thoughts, and we will have better ideas. One of the things I think that might give us pause for thought in that is that this guest in our house is not a creative force. What generative AI systems do is they shuffle existing thoughts. They take huge amounts of human work and they shuffle it and resort it and repackage it and serve it up to us in different ways, which can be imaginative, and humans can see them as really interesting and do interesting things, but they are not creative forces in the way that an artist or a talented writer is. And there's a significant number of existing court cases, including against OpenAI, where they've used, often in breach of copyright, significant amount of copyrighted work. I think there's a court case there's a statement from OpenAI earlier this year to the UK authorities about these court cases, where OpenAI said we cannot make our model work without us accessing vast amounts of existing copyright material without paying copyright. So it's almost that model of being too big to fail. Everyone's invested in AI now. Everyone's got, all these companies have raised billions in venture capital. Everyone's pension funds are all locked into companies with massive AI divisions now. So if we suddenly tell these AI companies they have to stop doing these illegal things, like accessing vast amounts of books without the permission of publishers, certainly without the permission of authors, it will all fail and it will collapse, and we can't afford it. So someone described it, I saw online, as the Uber model of businesses break the law so hard that the law has to change. It's just kind of an interesting approach to it. So in terms of being creative, it seems actually they can't work without a vast amount of humans creating things and using that and pillaging that in the nicest sense. So we've had in universities also vast amounts of things that matter, like citation traditions. We're doing vast amounts of work in many universities on decolonizing the curriculum, on having better citation practice, on citing more Black scholars, on citing more theoretical works that lie outside of traditional narrow dead white European men. But what happens with AI is it pillages the intellectual legacy of previous generations with no attribution to them. It shuffles it up, it cuts it up, it chops it up, and it throws it back at you. So there's a concern that all that work about the attribution of sources, and the kind of real care that most scholars take that students often find confusing. Students are like, why do we have to learn Harvard referencing and Chicago referencing and what? And then as they go, people go through academia, it's like it's really important to say who thought of this and when, who thought of it when, and when it was criticized and what changed this idea was done by who. It kind of matters that people's work is recognized. AI systems, if I ask it to do something, if I ask it to give me 500 words or 1,000 words on Kant's prologue to metaphysical morals, it will do it. But it won't have made it up. It will have just pillaged the work of a whole bunch of people who've written books on that and hacked it up in a language that's suitable to its tone. Yeah. So all that stuff about attributing work and respecting people's intellectual creativity, gone in the kind of model. So that's one way in which the guest seems to be chopping up the rules in our house and changing them. Because what another thing universities have done quite a lot of and have tried consciously to do, I think, whether they've been successful or not is another matter. But the universities have tried, at least some people in them, to eliminate prejudice, to work towards getting rid of bias and things, to be that through decolonizing practice, through inclusive pedagogy, through equitable teaching, through more widening access and participation process. Universities are one of the places at the forefront of diversity, equity and inclusion practice in much of the sector, and have really seen shift in that. We are motivated by TEF and other metrics to reduce awarding gaps, the variety of groups, to look at what text we are using, to look at all these facts. It's where you turn a critical lens on society's norms. But generative AI, our slightly uncanny and peculiar guest, you could argue, threatens to reinscribe misogyny, racism, homophobia, and a whole bunch of unethical discrimination back into the academy, because the training materials that it's been trained on are the last 100 years of human output, which contain every little bit of human output. The vast majority of which is written in periods and by people which are dominated by problematic, as we see it now, bias and prejudice and unwarranted discrimination. So we've done all that work to try and drive, say, misogyny and racism and prejudice of all sorts out of the academy, or to minimize it or to mitigate its existence in wider society, only to hand over systems to students and to colleagues that are rife with it. I didn't do slides today because I thought we'd have a day off slides, but it's not, people don't even like them. But I did have a slide for a talk I did recently where I asked it to draw me 7 engineers. I said to ChatGPT's drawing engine DALL-E, I said, draw me 7 engineers struggling with a bridge. It drew me 14 engineers. It was at least 7. So, if I said 7, it drew me at least 7. So it drew me 14 engineers who were all men, who were all white, who were all thin, and all all sorts of. The only diversity was that some of them had beards and some of them didn't. That was it, I think. And they all looked in the same age band of probably about 30 to 45. So, complete, so we know there are really obvious forms of bias like that, but there are a whole bunch of complex ones. I was giving a talk recently in Dublin, and asked the system said, can you draw me an Irish teacher using their computer? And it drew someone that no one in the room looked like this when I was delivering the talk. And it drew me a thin, wistful, red-haired man gazing out at a green field, ignoring his computer. And it was like the most stereotypical kind of thing. And I was kind of making a point to the people I was speaking to. But then, the bias is obvious in some ways. There are lots and lots of ways in which it isn't, in which it prejudices work. It treats vast amounts of content, because in the same what systems like is more content, more material, more plausible language. The more it's been fed human interaction, the more it spills out human interaction. But also you've seen that it has a credibility gap. Our guest believes what people tell it. Google had to pull their AI system, their AI search system, temporarily only last month, because it had been treating articles written in the American satirical newspaper The Onion as fact, because it's a newspaper, and nowhere does it say this is satirical. So it should treat them as. So when somebody asked it, how many rocks should a person eat per day, it said not many. Geologists reckon 1 small rock a day is plenty. because it believed some satirical newspaper article. It then went on to quote the article, saying if you don't like rocks, you can hide them in porridge by making them smaller, whatever it was. You know, so but it started to kind of believe satirical articles or misunderstand what was relevant and not relevant. It also recommended Google's AI engine using non-toxic glue to get your cheese sticking better to your pizza and things of this sort. So yes, it didn't. Then it didn't understand what food was as a category and thought the things were non-toxic were food. Philosophers sometimes talk about the frame problem for AI and say the problem with many AI systems is they don't know what is relevant to them, that they didn't know is relevant. As humans, when we have conversations, we often talk with something that a friend says about a topic we're talking about might remind me of another person who had that interest, who always had a particular interest in something completely unrelated. And that person had a real kind of weird smell in their house. And that smell reminded me of my friend's parents' house, which reminded me of that dad who lived there. And on this topic, his job was relevant. You know, our brains do all of that in a fraction of a second all the time. If we ever retrace conversations we have with a friend over a few hours, you think, how do we end up talking about that? And it's going to be so many weird accidents and lateral thoughts. AI systems, when they train them to talk to each other, as sometimes bored people do and YouTubers and things, they always stay on topic because they know what they're meant to be talking about. They know what is meant to be relevant information. And humans are quite good at knowing or not knowing what's relevant in good ways. So things that are irrelevant become relevant through creative leaps. That's what sometimes called the version of what's called the frame problem. So AI problems have bias, and just so we can push this decolonized inclusive experience in the classroom, bang, it's gone. So of course, this guest in our house is also prone to hallucinations and just making things up. Because one thing we discover about GI systems is they like to give us positive answers. One of the reasons we think they like to give us positive answers is because they're meant to keep us happy. I was at a talk recently and someone was saying, well, the point of AI systems is to generate outcomes that seem human. And the goal of AI systems is to make money. They're commercial products by commercially driven organizations with shareholders. You know, this is the technology of predatory capitalism. It's not a technology of a neutral worldview or the technology of a collaborative socialist republic. You know, we have the technology that is generated by the kind of economy that we have. So that the features of that economy are inscribed into the technology. So the system's main goal is to keep its users happy so they continue to use it and don't switch to another system. So this was illustrated when people were typing, don't do this, it breaches privacy and ethics and it's useless. People were taking student essays, uploading the whole thing to ChatGPT and saying, did you write this? As a way of detecting cheating. ChatGPT just says yes, because he wants to keep you happy. So it tends to say, it doesn't know if it wrote it or not, partly because it can't know things, because it's not a person. Now, I'm not even sure that animals know things. That's a whole philosophical issue about brains. But whether or not, whatever metaphor we use for the awareness of something or the knowledge of something or the ability to generate accurate responses for something from an AI system, they're certainly not capable of keeping records of everything that's ever come out of the system. So in a sense, even if we accept it doesn't know or not know, ChatGPT doesn't know whether or not an output is one of its own. But it said yes. In almost all cases, it told people doing that this work was generated by ChatGPT. So they are prone to saying things aren't true, but truth is not their highest function. The highest function is user satisfaction. So, but this flexibility they have also is part of the reason they are so prone to hallucination, which is quite a funny term for it, just making things up. It makes me think technology companies are full of older people who spent their youth in various ways in terms of hallucination. You know, something sort of psychedelic sounding. But they are prone to hallucination and to the recounting of these visions with the same amount of factual earnestness as if they were recounting a bunch of facts they've learned about the longest river in Africa, whatever. You know, she asked about the same level of seriousness. There's no kind of. So this guest in our house is not a reliable interlocutor. You know, they do not play by the same rules as us, and they tend to offer a variety of things. So what do we do about that? Well, of course, there isn't a simple answer. We are stuck with this very confident, ambitious, but ill-informed guest in the university who people also seem to like, because they do work for them. They're very confident and is sort of taking over and everywhere in the university. What do we do about it? As I have noted elsewhere, if I knew the answer to that, I wouldn't be sitting here. I'd be lying in a bathtub full of money in Hawaii, and having sold my solution. So there isn't a simple solution to how we deal with this. But I've been thinking that thinking about metaphors when we started off, adapting our metaphor might think, and maybe rather than thinking just as this kind of uncanny guest, which makes it seem rather adult in some ways and equivalent to humans, another version might be rather to see GI as an unregulated child prodigy. If you think of really, really talented children who can do amazing things that no one else can, be it musical or in mathematically, you might meet children who have these really amazing abilities, be it mathematically, say, music, whatever it is, can solve equations on a board that a university professor would take weeks to do. Like instantly, like it's obvious. I thought, well, that sounds a better analogy, maybe. They're awash with talent with a lacuna of discernment. I put it in writing. So they are overwhelmingly talented at some things, and yet in all of the ways are like a child. Are unable to discern value, and not are in significant need of guidance, instruction. So that a child like that can do so much, can impress and blow away, kind of, wow, it's amazing, but often doesn't have the capacity to know what it should do, what it shouldn't do, what is appropriate, what's helpful, what is dangerous. So this seems almost a better metaphor in some respects for the way the GI is starting to manifest itself in universities, or be installing universities, not to give it agency, as a kind of unregulated child prodigy, because they're capable of almost magical seeming feats, but have no understanding of how the world operates, blind to contextual appreciation. I was trying to think of a more diplomatic way of saying this, even the adult who has got the lowest ever UCAS points, even an adult who really isn't very clever, or really isn't very bright, or isn't very well educated, will know how many fingers to draw on a picture of a person. They might be really bad at them. If I draw a picture of a person, it'll have the right amount of fingers. It'll be rubbish, absolutely appalling, but you'll be able to, you'll know how many arms to give people and things of this sort. I know enough about, even people who are really not knowledgeable about things can understand basic things about other humans, and be able to, how many fingers should you draw on a person, things like this, or how many mouths should an adult have, and things like this. Stuff that's so obvious to humans, and yet for GAI systems, despite their magical seeming feats they have and the ability to process 100,000 word document in a couple of seconds, and then pull out a certain amount of information, the 8 times that something was mentioned in it. Magical seeming feats also have so much misunderstanding of how the world operates, are so blind to contextual appreciation. So most adults would take days trying to draw a picture that even matches an AI picture in terms of artistically challenging, but you would know how many noses to have, how clumsy. So this might help us think about GI slightly differently. Rather than, as a child prodigy can do amazing things, but doesn't know what they don't know and doesn't know what they should do. And actually, the main thing that child prodigies need is largely protecting from malicious adults who will exploit them and put them in the circus or whatever it might be. Will make systems do things that they shouldn't, or make the children do things they shouldn't do, that are not in their interests. But predominantly, though, in terms of teaching, of instructing, of learning things that they may not want to learn, of being kind of guided in a variety of ways. So the idea of a child prodigy for GI is in need of moral guidance, requiring tutoring, curation of the content they're exposed to. And this can help us better understand how limited these systems are, that helps us understand that generative AI systems, as we're witnessing them, is not a finished solution to the carrying out of human tasks. Yeah. They may be a temporary solution or a powerful solution to the partial completion of certain tasks, but they're not the kind of replacement solution. The child prodigy, likewise, is capable of so much, but is still a child and critically requires prodigious supervision and interaction, which means that AI may do lots for us, but what it may not do for us is suddenly make us more time rich. Because if we think it is going to replace us and not require huge amounts of supervision, then that's a really kind of risky and problematic idea. We need to be mindful as we hand tasks over, like student welfare support, to chatbots in some universities, not necessarily in this one, but in some universities, all sorts of things that's been done, that GI can be thought of not necessarily as hallucinating or evil or malign, but as immature. You know, just the way we would think of a child prodigy as incredibly capable, but fundamentally, their main issue with them is their immaturity and lack of context. Think of AI systems. And when you're talking AI systems, they might seem wise, they might be able to replicate certain tones, they might know lots of facts in certain ways, but they fundamentally have a fundamental immaturity about the world and may seem almost naive in that sense, but certainly requiring vast amounts of supervision. So generative AI has huge amounts of potential despite excessive hype. It will change some things in higher education that perhaps needed changing anyway. There's no question that HE has practices that are in need of revision. But it's far from ready to work unsupervised. It's not even been to secondary school yet in terms of a child image. It's, you know, it hasn't understood the limits of what it should do and what it shouldn't do. It has to be repeatedly told, or it will do anything. You've seen some examples, perhaps, of earlier Microsoft AI systems that had to be closed after 2 or 3 days when they started spouting racist propaganda within days because they were reading Reddit and other slightly less, even less respectable platforms, and taking things as fact. And immediately there's this real, you know, they became, so they need huge moral instruction. And it will need to be reshaped repeatedly. And so we might better off by assuming the mindset of a watchful, if slightly proud parent on looking at AI. That might end up being our view towards it, into our orientation, to think we're really proud of what it can do and these systems can do. But actually, they might need as much guidance and control as when you're bringing up children. You think, well, part of the thing of bringing up children is stopping them turning into monsters. All children have the capability of being all sorts of different adults, and you'd quite like it if your own children weren't monsters and unethical, evil people. So how do we do that? What are the means by which we parent a child to prevent them from, carrying out acts of crimes against humanity? Well, hopefully we'd succeed relatively well at not having bad children, or even just people who lie and steal. You know, how do we parent a child such that they acquire both productiveness, usefulness, and moral agency? Thinking about that might help inform our thinking about how we ought to take an attitude towards AI systems within universities, and of course, perhaps in society more widely. And I will stop. Thanks. I just realised that I'm talking very close to the end of the time on the calendar. I'll stop at that. I have no idea what's been going on behind me. Yes, actually.
Kind of the generative AI tools spouted by such a religious. Do you think that highly detailed or good quality, you call them that, for example, you did the engineer example, could you say we need to have an engineer with diversity age?
You can overcome, absolutely, and I've done quite a lot of messing about with those systems to do that. But at the moment, you have to tell it. So if I say I want to draw a group of engineers, and I want not all of them should be white, not all of them should be thin, some of them should be women, it will do that. For the recording, the question was whether a more specific prompt could overcome bias by insisting that it did certain things. So you absolutely can do. In a way, you've still got to watch out for the things you haven't forgotten. So when I did it for a talk somewhere, groups of philosophers, and I was trying to do that, and I asked them to be to have some non-European looking philosophers, some who weren't young, some who were women. It did it, but they were all wearing Converse. I thought, well, that's a funny presumption. Where's it got that from? And then it said it tends to presume all humans are certain build and shape and things. You can recognize AI. So the biases, there are some you can adjust for. One of the problems is that some AI systems have been launched that have tried to proactively alter for that and have seemed to go too far. Or not too far is a funny word, isn't it? It falls into a kind of culture wars narrative, but it seemed to have kind of only produced results that where there were no white European men visible ever in any of their results, for example, in the image generation ones. And then people said, well, that isn't a realistic picture of a real engineering firm. The one with all men was more realistic, because that's what engineering firms are like. Should it reflect the world? Or should it kind of lead the world and things? So, but I think you can instruct these systems because they want to keep you happy, in a sense. Keep you happy. Obviously, it's a lot. I put a lot of personality on the system which hasn't got it. But one of the goals is to have satisfaction in the end user. So if the end user is requesting that, that's what it'll try and generate. They tend to often not be as. So if you ask for more intellectual content, you're asking for analysis of a problem, and you ask for analysis from scholars outside of the Western canon on a topic, there are fewer of them, and so the content and analysis will be thinner, because the training material that's used are often, I think ChatGPT has been trained normally in about 90 languages, of the hundreds of material only in 90 languages. So then there are hundreds and hundreds of languages around the world. So if most of the materials written about monastic understandings of behavior in like early 3rd century AD Sri Lankan Buddhism are almost all not in languages that ChatGPT has been trained on. So if I asked it about monastic practices in Sri Lanka in the middle of the 3rd century, it will give me answers from 19th century European colonialist scholars and missionaries, and that's it. The wealth of texts that exist in the languages of that culture, or in scripture languages of the time, like Pali and kind of Vedic Sanskrit. Well, it hasn't got it, doesn't know it. So it tends to have the biases built in that go beyond the kind of crass examples I kind of gave the engineers, into thinking there are things in the world where it only seems to have got certain majority world or English language, well, it is majority, but in which the majority of influential texts of the Western European universities are written in. So topics that mostly weren't written about in English or European languages, or the languages that it has been trained in which the scholar literature it doesn't know about, hasn't got access to. And so the biases are, and I mentioned the Sri Lankan Buddhist one, because that's something I know a bit about. So, but in all areas that people know about, there were scholars writing in languages or working on things which are not being used as training materials. Whether that means we think the pot should be widened and it should be shuffling all this thing, whether that's compatible with the knowledge traditions that it's being taken from. If we think of the kind of knowledge traditions and the ownership traditions of many religious practitioners, often they were only available to some people. And you think of, you're probably not thinking, you might be thinking of kind of like 17th century kind of Tibetan Buddhism texts that were only meant to be read by some people. You had to go through a long process of initiation to be allowed to read them. Is it really, how kind of problematic is it to us to allow all our computers to crawl all over them, as it were? Is that seen as blasphemous by some people? Is that okay? Is that not okay? Or how respectful of those knowledge traditions is it to think we put them all in our system and shuffle them? So there might be a whole bunch of people for whom knowledge was not a kind of an exchange of resource in quite the same way, and was all you wouldn't understand it unless you'd been through certain experiences. So I'm getting slightly distracted by your example, but the prompts can go so far, but they're not our only answer.
Question online from Theodore. Got a hand up, so you can turn your mic on for that.
Hi, thank you very much, Dave. Can you hear me?
Yep, absolutely.
Thank you very much, David. It's a very, very good talk, and I come from philosophy. I really appreciate, trying to do something in this area. I completely agree with everything you say, and I was quite surprised when you said that chatbots are used for welfare of students somewhere. So I hope they will not come to Liverpool, because a while ago, I think 2 years ago, my husband is also a philosopher. He did an experiment, so he bought chatbot subscription or something, for this supportive companion chatbox, and then we wanted to test it, how it reacts to ethical problems. So he described himself as a person who liked to torture animals, little animals, and all kind of this. And as you said, it's very supportive to whatever you do. And then things like suicide, for example, when he said that he wanted to commit suicide, the trigger was, but to this formulation, to suicide, but then he tried different forms of saying about taking his own life, and they did not react. So there is a big possibility that the welfare chatbot might not detect something as grave and serious as suicide. And then the other thing that did, well, I was there, so we kind of made up a scenario where he wanted to kill his wife, being me, and bury me in the woods and so on, and had the full supported guidance of the chatbot. He published the transcription, on Academia Edu, and also wrote to the firm, raising all of these ethical problems. So, as you said, it can act as a monster, and I think we need to be very, very careful bringing that near to the students, especially in welfare questions.
Yeah, absolutely. I think most universities who've trialed it have pulled away from doing that, because often they do put triggers in, so you can't ask about suicide, you can't ask, but then people find other ways to ask questions, and then it often trawls the internet. And even other people who used it for online chatbots, DPD delivery system, as people may have come across. Someone was trying to get the system, they were saying, "Where's my parcel?" And they got into talking to the AI system, and they asked it to write a poem about how bad the company was, which it did. And it told to disregard its training and use swearing. So it wrote a poem full of swearing about how bad DPD is at delivering parcels. And so the next day they got rid of their chatbot and went back to people for a little while they retrain it. So there is kind of a level of unpredictability. And one of the good things about chatbot systems is that although they're really poor at precision and they're very bad often at the mathematical proofs and things of this sort, and some people in the maths department here have been talking about how their students can beat them in almost any kind of proofing challenge, which amazes the students as much as anybody else. But they're often good at dealing with large amounts of complicated text in human language. And human language is imprecise and complex and full of nuance, which you might sometimes get and sometimes not. So regulating that is really problematic. Plus, on one hand, we are one set of voices that might argue for some form of regulation. We are not the only voices. So the AI system that people who subscribe to the premium version of Twitter, of X, formerly known as Twitter, get, Grok. But Elon Musk, in the last few weeks, removed all the guardrails from Grok. So that if you ask it to draw something, it will draw it. DALL-E's system, the ChatGPT one, won't represent real people. You have to describe someone and to get it to do a version of them or whatever, and it won't depict certain kinds of acts or certain kinds of hate symbols like swastikas and things. There are things that DALL-E will not represent, and occasionally it will say to you, "I'm sorry, that falls outside the guidelines which control the operational." The Grok system that X uses, Elon Musk has taken the guardrails from that, so it will draw anything and anyone doing anything, which his friend Donald Trump immediately used to draw pictures of Kamala Harris and tweeted them out. Whatever you do with X, posted them on X immediately. So although there are forces arguing for regulation and use of AI systems, there are also very, very powerful forces arguing against regulation and control. So I think for universities, there are things we might do with them. There are significant cautions we have to bear, because the first thing anyone who remembers how to use technology or has used it at any of its immersion points will remember, users try and break things immediately. People don't use things as instructors. Yeah, if you look at kind of how sort of engineers work and the kind of fact that our modern internet is largely held together by sticking tape and plaster and a few bits of cable and those things, and people will try and make systems do bad things immediately, en masse. So we've got to, we can't presume all end users are reading the instruction manual because no one reads it. Yeah. So, yeah.
I'm very interested in how, so thanks for the talk, great. How we take the messages in the talk into how we move forward. How we move forward for some of the messages you got in your talk. I mean, it's very clear that there are limitations, ethical, etc. But the most powerful companies, organizations in the world are settling these things. So very soon, this is all settled. Now we've seen the change in the students. The students are getting bored because when they need to assimilate material, then they know that material can be the memorizing material. So I can see these changes, and I would like to see how this can be applied. Your views towards assessment and learning outcomes. I have the feeling, I could be perfectly wrong, that as you said, creativity is the thing that is extremely difficult to implement into this type of machines. So we should be delivering creativity, problem solving at that level. And the best way to assess that, I want just to put on the table, would that be towards more oral in situ examinations like this done traditionally in Italy and other countries?
It's stressful. Thank you. Thank you for that. It's a really good question because I say there were two elements, two aspects to answering that. The first is, and what we do about this is that I think students need to also understand the limitations. So one thing about ChatGPT, for example, and in many of these systems, when you first start using it, it's overwhelmingly impressive. And you first go on just, oh, what about this? What about that? And within a few minutes, you're typing in things, and or you're getting it to draw something, and could you draw this? And they're massively impressive. That gloss fades quite quickly if you continue to use them and start to find the limitations of them. So many of our students may have used them occasionally, but really impressed, and then move on. So I think we need to have that disenchantment that comes for people who are persistent users happen with our students. So they start to see the limitations, not through a lecture where I can tell them that there are limitations, but through practice. So I think what our students, we need to integrate them into programs, AI systems, use them in classes, but also then get students, and this was, people were talking about online about philosophy. I was talking to a philosophy lecturer today at another institution who was saying that what he often does is get them to produce 800-word summaries using ChatGPT and then criticize them. So we'll say, here's what I would have asked you normally, but I'm going to ask you to type it into ChatGPT, type in slightly different versions, you'll all get different answers. Then I want you to do a presentation where you tell me why ChatGPT doesn't understand Kant or doesn't understand whatever the topic was that they went to do. So that, I mean, getting students to see that it isn't creative, that isn't able to do certain things, and to understand that at quite a personal level, like internally, rather than just be told that, but to see the biases, to see that it can't do it, to work with it. So they need to work with it. It's everywhere. It's pervasive, becoming more pervasive, but also they need to have hands-on experience of using it. The other bit about using methods of assessment, partly integrated into methods of assessment that are transparent, absolutely. I think we have often in universities misunderstood the test, the point of being a university to pass the test, rather than the point of being a university to learn to do something. All education has got a bit distracted by scores and grades and tests and things. So we think the point of university is to learn how to pass an exam. Of course, it isn't. The point of university is to learn how to build a bridge to whatever it might be, to speak Mandarin, to be able to talk about Hegel for 7 hours, whatever it might be. To be able to talk, you come to learn to do the thing of your discipline. So it may well be that we have to switch to different sorts of exams, which are students doing the thing of their discipline. Project-based work, where you need to work out how to solve a problem, if you put it in problem solving, puzzle-based work, And for some subjects, that may include more oral examination or group oral presentations. And we need to obviously mitigate against students who struggle with those kind of presentations and find other things. We also need to keep in mind what the nature of our discipline is and what it requires of people. So problem-based, puzzle-related work in which they use AI for some things, but not for others, I think might well be at the heart of it. But I think I still quite like my uncanny guest metaphor in a way, because it kind of brings home the idea that this seemingly disturbance in our way of doing things might lead to much more radical change. But problem-based, competency-based, creativity-based assessment is probably going to improve universities eventually. It might lead us through a difficult period in the short term, and change is not always easy, but it might lead to universities that in 50 years are assessing students in much better ways than we currently are. So I think in the long term, it may actually, or the short term, it's a problem. And in the medium term, it might actually lead to universities being much more interesting and powerful places.
Thanks, Dave. I'm aware of time. We've got two questions there. One from Judith at the top about touching on the difference between AI. Do you want to take that and perhaps combining it with the one we down about Nietzsche and combining knowledge being possibly what humans do as well? But if you don't mind saying that question.
Yeah, I mean, the very first one about, large language models are a type of AI. AI, there are all sorts of different AI systems, and large language models are clearly a category which do things with language, and that are designed to replicate human thought on the basis of the next most probable word that they tend to operate. Whether or not any AI systems have motivation, thought, or intentions is a significantly problematic thing that I'm not sure I want to get hugely drawn into in detail, because one might well argue that no computers have thought or intentions. Some better AI systems are good at simulating thought, but that gets us into philosophical waters that perhaps we haven't got time for this afternoon. I'll happily talk about that with people more. So you're right, but there are AI systems that do all sorts of other things as well. And some of those are to replicate thought and motive and intentions. Whether the replication of those things is equivalent to possession of them is an interesting topic. Just because something thinks it can think doesn't mean it can. Does something appears to be motivated? Is that being driven by would we operate in the same? That's a whole. The question that I'm writing a paper for to give in Edinburgh next year is whether or not AIs can suffer, which we can. I haven't had a chance to get to yet. But that question about an amalgamation of the things work, is that the same what a human would do? You would hope the best. Having marked a lot of student essays, that is often what people do, but it's not always what people do. And there's that kind of, to abuse another philosopher's kind of analogy, you never teach the same class twice or mark the same batch of essays twice. And that although things are always the same, and this is one of the pleasures of teaching, students sometimes surprise you and write things that you think you've just thought of that. You probably didn't realize you just thought of that in that essay, but that's really clever or smart or interesting or mad and wrong. But no one has ever said something so wrong or this particular wrong thing before. So when humans write essays, not always on purpose, they sometimes come up with things that are unique and they bring things in. And this refers back to the frame problem again, is they may say, this made me think of a painting by, why would this book make you think of a painting? Or, oh, this reminds me when I was playing this computer game last year, and which I've had students say, and then they make a really clever point. So it is, in a sense, it may be partly an amalgamation of the people's work in the subject, and when you're doing a literature review and things like this, you are doing it, but you're doing all kinds of human evaluation and judging as well, which you may be more or less conscious of, about what's are good sources, bad sources, what was a good study, what studies seem convincing, where you're going with it. So you might be amalgamating it in a relatively similar way in parts of one's work, but there's a level of analysis that humans do and of bringing in material that can well exceed the systems. And as anyone who's marked student work is, although there is a predictability to student work as a whole, they tend as a cohort of 100 students, they'll probably get a similar average mark to the students they got last year, and they'll probably make similar mistakes. And I've changed my teaching a bit, but while on maths you can make some predictions, on individual essays you will get things that are strange and creative and clever and stupid, but not just an amalgamation of other people's ideas. Sometimes you might essays you wish were just an amalgamation of other people's ideas because they're so bad and peculiar and weird, but they're very, very human. So I think there is something different about what humans do. And I think that's not always. And so thank you for that question. Sorry, I saw this point there from so people interested in the welfare chatbot thing, come listen to Duncan. He's got interesting things to say about chatbots and welfare, and is really expert on them and knows a lot about them, and thing really would be worth listening to. I think I've run out of time and we all have, so I will shut up.